Welcome to our AJA Zoom events. If you're a regular, then you'll know what it's all about, and welcome to any new people this week. Welcome also to those watching on Facebook and to anybody listening to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Community Radio, which in Melbourne is at FM 88. Or if you're interstate, it's at j-air.com.au. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. And also on your screen is David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guests for tonight, John Ruddick, Daniel Lewkovitz from the Liberal Democrats of New South Wales. And have we got David Segal? Hopefully he's the candidate standing in the controversial seat of Goldstein. This week, the topic is the role of the smaller parties, and in particular, the Liberal Democrats. So we're going to chat with the guys for about 30 minutes and then take questions from the audience. If you're not familiar with the routine, the way to indicate that you want to ask a question is to electronically raise your hand. And the way to do that is in the reaction button at the bottom of your screen. You can put some written questions on the chat function, and Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs, will read some of them out during question time. Now, the federal election is on the way, and many of Scott Morrison's quiet Australians who voted for the coalition last time could very well be asking themselves what's happened to the Conservative side of politics, with there hardly being any differences between Labor and the Libs. Of course, regarding Israel and the Middle East, there is a substantial difference. And if Labor manages to con their way into power, heaven help those of us interested in Israel advocacy, because there will be nothing holding back the anti-Israel forces within Labor, despite what their moderates may say. But there are alternatives to vote for, and one of the minor parties fielding candidates in many electorates, including in New South Wales and Victoria that have a strong Jewish presence, is the Liberal Democrats. So what's this party all about? Can they make any differences in our system dominated by the two major parties? And how can we vote for the Lib Dems in a useful way, or is it simply a wasted vote? To answer these questions tonight, we're joined by John Ruddick, a senior Senate candidate in New South Wales, Daniel Lewkovitz, who is standing in Wentworth and who was also involved in the formation of the AJA, and David Segal, who is standing in the electorate of Goldstein in Melbourne and is up against Zoe Daniel, a climate alarmist who only discovered a concern for Israel after she was dropped into the second most populous Jewish electorate in the state. So, gentlemen, thank you for your time. Welcome to our Zoom session.
Thank you very much, Alan. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I'm going to start by handing over to David, and then we'll get the show on the road.
Okay, well, welcome and thank you for joining our discussion this evening. John, I'd like to fire the first question to you.
Yes.
And can you tell us a little about what the Liberal Democrat Party is all about, and why you in particular are standing as the lead Senate candidate in New South Wales, given your track record of having been a devotee of the Liberal Party for so long?
Okay, well, thank you, David. Okay, so this is how I see it. Australia became a country in 1901, and in that time, the Prime Ministership of this country has been, for 75% of the time, been held by a member of the Liberal Party or one of the parties that preceded the Liberal Party. A lot of people think Robert Menzies created a new party in the mid-1940s. He really just rebadged the previous party, and that had happened before. So the Liberal Party has really run Australia, and Australia is a very successful country. So you'd have to say the Liberal Party historically has done a very good job. Now, over that same period of time, 10 Downing Street and the White House have been almost perfectly 50-50 between their left and their right parties. But in Australia, the popular culture doesn't know this, but it's been very lopsided in favour of the Liberal Party, and they have done a good job. But something has gone wrong in the last, since John Howard left. But even John Howard's last two terms, in terms of economic policy, yes, he was focused on the war on terror. John Howard had really sort of given up on tough, gutsy economic reform. And if we are going to keep our prosperity, we have to keep our foot on the reform, the microeconomic reform pedal. So now what has happened is we had the Howard finished in 2007, then we had 6 years of Labor government, and Howard handed over to Kevin Rudd zero debt, zero Commonwealth government debt, which was terrific. And we had a big future fund as well. Now then, when Rudd's there and Gillard's there, they put the debt up to just over $250 billion. Abbott and Hockey in opposition said, this is outrageous, this is outrageous. Now then they came to power in 2013. Now before COVID, that Commonwealth debt had got up under 3 Liberal prime ministers. It had got up to $568 billion. We didn't have a war, we didn't have a recession. They didn't have, now Abbott tried to cut spending in his first budget. It was politically unpopular. Margaret Thatcher was in a similar position early in her prime ministership, and she said, and she had a recession when she brought in her reforms, and the polls were terrible. And she said, the lady ain't for turning. Now, Tony Abbott should have done that. He didn't. He capitulated in his second budget. Turnbull and Morrison have just been disinterested. And the share of government spending as a part of the GDP just keeps going up. Now, then we had COVID. Then we had COVID come along, and now the debt's over $1 trillion. Now, I had, in 2018, I wrote a book called Make the Liberal Party Great Again, which has a sort of a sexy name, I suppose, but it was really a bit of a technical manual on how to reform the Liberal Party. And what I was saying is we need to have mass democratisation internally of the Liberal Party. We need to have primaries to elect candidates. We need to have every member of the party should vote for the parliamentary leaders. Now, that may seem radical. That is how Boris Johnson became the leader. That is how Justin Trudeau became the leaders of their parties. This is standard Westminster practice, and that's what I was advocating for. I knew Scott Morrison wouldn't like it, and I was going to wait him out. I had a 10-year plan. We're going to bring in these reforms. But then what happened? COVID came along. Now, I believe that COVID was a serious public health issue. I know 2 people who have briefly had to be to hospital because of COVID. So I'm not underplaying COVID, but I am saying we hyped it up 20 times more than it was worth. We got all the debt, and we had a COVID police state, and then they have capitulated. Scott Morrison, 6 months ago, completely capitulated on the zero carbon economy, which I believe is national economic suicide. So I thought that there's 3 strikes and you're out. And I thought, okay, look, if the Liberal Party has failed this test, we need another alternative. And I was particularly disappointed that there were next to nobody in the federal parliament who was a member of the Liberal or the National Party who spoke out against these things. Now, a few did, then they got kicked out of the party. So I thought, look, even the conservative wing in the Liberal Party was just letting these things happen. So I thought we need a fresh start, and I decided to go with the Liberal Democrats.
Okay, well, let's turn now to Daniel Lewkovitz. Daniel, I think, has a little video that he wants to show us.
Just before we do that, David, Daniel's had to log back in, so
it's fine. He's fine.
Is he a co-host now?
All done. Okay. And so, Daniel, you can, and I want you, Daniel, also to address the question of why are you doing this? I mean, you're standing in a lower house seat. Most people would say the chances of success are relatively small or very small. So tell us a little about Daniel Lewkovitz and why you've put your hand up for this candidacy.
Sector are being targeted in a sophisticated state-based cyber attack. Here to break it down for us is Calamity Security expert
Daniel Lewkovitz, the CEO of Calamity Monitoring.
Thanks for having me and such a wonderful intro.
Standard home alarm. Daniel Lewkovitz is the CEO.
Our security expert uses a wire coat hanger to break into this house.
I've asked him to come on the program tonight because his observations are instructive to all of us across Australia.
4 weeks ago, in a story about how bike share schemes might be a terror threat, we said that Daniel Lewkovitz of Calamity Monitoring did not appear to have any particular expertise in terrorism.
Daniel Lewkovitz wrote, much contemporary security and law enforcement focuses on terrorism.
He has in fact provided terrorism-related training to New South Wales Police, the security industry and other high-risk private sector groups and individuals. We're happy to put the record straight and to apologise.
He's fighting back against these online slacktivists. A lot of other companies are going to have to learn how to do the same.
Oh, someone's watching us.
My staff are watching us 24 hours a day.
This is Calamity Monitoring's headquarters. First, we need to get into the building. And it's easier said than done.
These doors weigh about 200 kilos each, and no one gets in here unless we know who they are and we want them here.
From here, the security of thousands of homes and businesses across the country is monitored 24 hours a day.
It's technology that saves lives. I call the people at my office heroes in a headset because they literally save people's lives. It's a fantastic company, it's a fantastic service. And
everyone at home is watching and listening to you and thinking, why on earth were you contracted in to clean up the mess?
They're going to talk about things like clean energy and saving the planet. What they're not going to tell you, Rowan, is that the cobalt that's used in batteries is mined in Central Africa by children. So we've got people who are cheering this stuff on, and they're talking about integrity and ethics and the future of their children who can go to private schools in an electric car, but they're not talking about 6-year-olds who are actually pulling this out of the ground. So next time you hear that this is clean energy, or you hear Daniel Andrews talking about clean energy and the future for children, know that he's not talking about children that are actually dying because of this stuff, and there's nothing clean about that at all.
I mean, we seem to focus on Facebook all the time, but I mean, they're not the only culprit here, are they? Google, Amazon, Apple, would you say they're the main four?
Well, not only are they the ones that we know about, but there's all the other things lurking below the surface that we don't know about. And I suppose, look, privacy is a bit like virginity. There's a lot of temptations to give it away, but once it's gone, you never get it back. So if people...
Wow. Good morning, everybody.
So you've explained better than anyone I've heard in the last few weeks where the systemic failures are. Thank you very much for your time, Daniel, and I can tell you what, you'll be back on the show in a not too distant future.
No, your sound's not on, Daniel. You're unmuted, but the sound's not working.
No, we can't hear you.
Okay.
Maybe.
I might just do.
You're back.
Does that work?
That works.
Okay, sorry, the screen share, believe me, everyone can see and hear me. Okay, well, hello everyone. So having watched that, of course, that leads into the question that David asked at the top, which is, well, why would you want to enter politics? And it's an excellent question. Look, you know, people do ask that. They say, you've got a successful business, why would you want to take a pay cut and move to Canberra? And a number of years ago, if you'd asked me that question, I would have said, you're dreaming. Probably the first time in my life someone suggested that I enter politics was actually when I was in, I think, year 7 or 8, and we went on the compulsory school excursion to Canberra. And part of the school excursion to Canberra that all the school kids go on was meeting the local MP. Now, our local MP at the time, I went to Sydney Boys High School, was Jeanette McHugh, who was the member for Bligh. And so I was in a meeting there, and they said to all the students who'd like to ask a question. And one kid said, oh, do you get to ride around in a limousine? And another kid said, have you met the Prime Minister? And I put my hand up and said, so in the Gulf War, you led a protest against the Gulf War that ended up outside the Israeli embassy. Why did you do that? And she absolutely went nuts, and that started yelling and screaming and carrying on. And I've got a video of it that I'm really trying to find at the moment, but behind her, my then social studies teacher sort of walked in the field of camera, and he goes like, stop it, stop making trouble. And, you know, years later, knowing what I know more about the sort of left's long march through the institutions, I can guess exactly what the issue was. But someone came up to me later and said, you know, have you thought about politics? And as I said, no. But the last 2 years have really affected me in a number of ways. Now, I've felt for a very long time that we lack talent in Parliament. Once upon a time, that was a problem that was probably more to the Labor side. You had people who went from student representative councils or unions all the way through a party system, all the way to the front benches. And they'd never run a business, they'd never worked in a business, they'd certainly never owned a business, and so they were completely out of touch. But more recently, that malaise seems to have affected the Liberal side of the House as well. Now, again, you know, when things are okay, maybe you don't pay attention to it. It's a bit like, you know, you don't pay attention to your defective insurance policy until it comes time to make a claim. But seeing what's happened over the last few years has really, really affected me. John touched on it. I've watched the freedoms of this country be completely eroded. I know that it was the freedoms of this country that basically saved my family and many of the people in this chat, some of whom I know personally. And the country's actually now got a sickness. And I'll give you an example that's probably doesn't mean a lot to most Australians, but it means quite a lot to some of the people here. A couple of decades ago, we're all familiar with the refuseniks, and these were Russian Jews who were unable to leave the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union knew that the intellect that went with them would never come back if they were allowed to leave. Well, during the pandemic, every one of us actually became a refusnik. Now, I'm not talking about controls on people coming back into the country. I understand that, and I was involved tangentially with the hotel quarantine scheme, or at least the one in New South Wales that worked, not the one in Victoria that didn't. But we weren't allowed to leave the country. Now, most of us probably didn't notice that because, let's face it, nobody was, you know, planning their trip to Bali for the holidays. But there were some people who did notice it well and truly. There are members of the AJA certainly who couldn't go to weddings overseas, who couldn't go to funerals, who couldn't be the loved ones. And, you know, the Australian government said to anyone, look, if you want to leave, you can leave, but there's a good chance you may not be able to come back for 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. People could have made up their own mind and they could have gone. But that didn't happen. We were told in no uncertain terms, you may not leave. We were refuseniks. The only other country that did that in the pandemic was North Korea. And nobody in the Liberal Party said, this is not okay. Well, I did think it was not okay. I also sat and watched as businesses, including my clients who'd done nothing wrong, were told you no longer have a business. And those policies were driven and pushed by people who have lost nothing to date. They still have their job, they still have their comforts. Now, we will read in the newspapers that, you know, the economy's better than ever and everything's fantastic. And don't believe your lying lies when you walk through town and you see all these shops that are boarded up, or you see kids that had to pull their kids out of Mariah College or Scopus because of this. And it was an absolute tragedy. And that's what's really motivated me to put my hand up. Now, I've got a number of very big ideas and things that, you know, I'd like to see this country do, and I can perhaps talk a bit more about that later. But coming back to the question of why I did this, because, you know, if not now, when? And this really comes down to the country, the beautiful country that I want my children to grow up in, and a very dangerous course that we're on. Now, one thing that, you know, I'm careful what audiences I say this to, because I find generally, you know, comparisons between Western governments and, you know, the acts of authoritarian groups, the Nazis and so forth, generally those comparisons are very historically inaccurate and they're quite lazy. But there are some parallels that an educated audience here will appreciate, which is that the worst people in the history of mankind didn't just turn up overnight. There was a whole series of steps over a whole number of years that led up to them coming into power. And I'm seeing very bad signs. And in particular, I'm seeing that once freedoms get taken away, it's not easy to get them back. And that's why I'm basically very, very frustrated with the Liberal Party. I left them, just like John Ruddick did before me, and why I find the Liberal Democrats, a libertarian party, a party that just wants people to be left alone, that wants small government, that wants individual freedom and wants lower taxes, is really something as a father, as a Jew, as a businessman, that I can relate to well and truly and want to be a part of.
Seems that there's a bunch of people who fall into that category of ex-Liberals. A couple of prominent ones that I'll mention is Campbell Newman, former Premier of Queensland, is standing, I guess, as John Ruddick's counterpart in Queensland. And Ross Cameron, who's had a lot of experience as a Liberal politician, is also behind the scenes helping. John, I want to ask you to make a couple of comments about the voting, because we hear criticisms that voting for a minor party is a wasted vote, or alternatively, that voting for a minor party might actually help a Labor government. What is the advice from the LDP about voting, and how, and have you sorted out how to vote at this stage?
Okay, very good question, David. So in Australia in 1922, at federal elections, we introduced a thing called preferential voting. Not many democracies around the world have preferential voting, and I believe it is democratic best practice. Now, in the United States, if I was an American at the last election and I wanted Donald Trump to get re-elected, and there was a Libertarian Party who I probably agreed with more. However, I would have voted for Donald Trump because they have, like most democracies, like the United Kingdom, you get one vote. And if that candidate doesn't win, well, your vote is exhausted. Now, in Australia, and the Libertarian Party gets about 1% of the vote in America. There's a Greens Party in America, and they get about 1%, because if you vote for the Greens or you vote for the Libertarian Party, and that candidate doesn't win, which they're not going to, then your vote, you have no say on who the president is going to be. Now, in Australia, let's take the seat of Wentworth. Let's say somebody says, look, I think Daniel Lewkovitz is fantastic. I love the Liberal Democrats' Freedom Manifesto, but I am really, really scared about there being a Labor government. And obviously, Allegra Spender, if she is successful, she will vote for a Labor government if she was the swing vote in a hung parliament. I think that's a no-brainer. Now, so what we have the luxury in Australia, we have this democratic best practice where we can say, okay, I'm going to vote number 1 for Daniel. And now then let's hope Daniel gets through to the final 2. Okay, but if he doesn't get through to the final 2, the vote is that everybody has to vote. Let's say there's 10 candidates in Wentworth. Everybody has to put number 1 next to the candidate they like the most, in this case, Daniel. And then they will go down. They might put Mr. Sharma at number 2, and they can put Allegra Spender at number 10.
And the Greens at number 10.
Sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
So preferential voting is a very good thing, and it is a way of encouraging the party that may be a small party today, but that you want to become a bigger party.
Okay, so your vote doesn't dilute it all. You can, now, there are 2 other small parties I wanted to mention. You have an arrangement, don't you, with the United Australia Party of preferencing each other first, second. And at a previous election, and Daniel sort of hinted at this already, David Leylandholm, who was a Liberal Democrat senator, announced that the Greens would be last in every electorate every time. Is that still the policy?
Certainly, it's certainly my policy, David, but I mean, people talk about preference deals, and I can see someone in questions has already asked that, so I might just pick up on what John was saying. Now, the first thing is, look, David Leylandholm put out it was basically a joke video, but it was very, very entertaining, where he said he'd like to announce a preference deal between the Lib Dems and the Greens, and everybody sucked in their breath and thought, is he crazy? And then he said, we will put them last on every ballot in every state, every time, and they can get stuffed. And it was a fantastic video, and if you've ever followed Leylandholm's work, it was very much on brand. But interestingly, you know, when I've been walking around, you know, Bondi Junction, Double Bay, whatever, and you know, I've had people have come over for a chat, and even in the questions here, and the first thing, you know, they demand to know is, where are you directing your preferences? And this is something that people don't understand. In Australia, we have compulsory voting. You're all forced to vote, but very, very few people actually understand how the system works. It's a bit like saying you must drive a car, but we're not going to teach you how to drive it. And here's what people don't get. Nobody can direct your preferences except you. Nobody.
Correct.
It hasn't been that way for a very long time. The only thing that political parties can do is they can hand out a how to vote card, which is just a recommendation, it's a flyer, outside the voting booth. And you're free to follow it if you want, or ignore it. So if you want to put me first, Dave Sharma second, or you want to put me first, you know, the Greens second because you've got a acquired brain injury or something, then that's certainly something that you can do. There is no scope, none, for a party to direct their preferences elsewhere. So when you hear about preference deals, really all that is that's me, for example, going to, say, the United Australia Party and Natalie Duma, she's a Jewish candidate in Wentworth, and saying, I will put you at number 2. And she says, fine, well, if you do that, I'll put you at number 2. But all that means is that that's what it's going to say on the stationery that we hand out, the flyers that we hand out. Whether you follow that or not is entirely up to you. Your actual preferences are between you, that piece of paper, and that pencil, and nobody else. Now, the big parties don't want you to know that, because it's in their interest for you to believe wrongly that a vote for X is really a vote for Y. So they might say that, a vote for Daniel really means a vote for Labor. It doesn't mean that at all. If you'd like to have a bet each way and you'd like to put a nice Jewish boy at number 1, or me anyway, and you'd like to put a former Israeli ambassador at number 2, so you have a bet each way, you can do that, and nobody else can take that away from you. So anytime people say, where are you directing your preferences? My answer to that is, wherever you'd like your preferences to go, that's where they're going to go. And people really need to understand that, because otherwise all that's happening is the two major parties keep getting rewarded for bad behaviour and nothing ever changes. But some really fantastic up-and-coming parties such as the Lib Dems don't get heard from because there's a concerted effort to basically keep us out of play.
Okay, now, one thing I want to ask both of you before I hand back to Alan, and he's got some questions for the Melbourne candidate, is, of course, although the election's not going to be fought on Jewish issues and on Israel, etc., it's clearly a major issue to the Jewish community. Now, I'm going to share a personal anecdote about John Ruddick. Before he was a candidate, we met at a Spectator Australia function, and John came up to me and spontaneously said how much he supported Israel. And I was wearing, as I usually do, an Australia-Israel friendship pin, which I gave to him and pinned on his coat. So to the extent that you can each of you make a very quick comment on, in the event that you were successful, how you guys would vote on issues such as the recognition of Jerusalem, the moving of the Australian embassy to Jerusalem, or anything else you like that's Israel related. Just about 30 seconds each, please.
Sure, John, after you. No.
Okay, well, look, I have, my favourite subject all my life has been history. I believe Abraham was a real historical figure who lived 4,000 years ago. I believe the portrait that we see in the ancient Jewish scriptures is very, very accurate historically. And I think that the scholarship is bearing that out over the last generation or two. I believe that it's the greatest epic of mankind. I have read this book, Paul Johnson, The History of the Jews, twice. I read it about 15 years ago. Whenever I have a beer or a dinner with my close friends, they've all heard me Bible bash or proselytize them about the magnificent contribution that the Jewish people have made to humanity. Humanity hasn't been very good to the Jews in return on many occasions, but it is this, I believe there is something divine. I believe it is true that God said to Abraham, you know, I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you, and you will be a blessing to the nations. I believe it, and I'm not a particularly religious person, but I think there's something going on there. In terms of Israel, I understand that, you know, from the 1800s onwards, a lot Jews were moving into that part of the world. After the tragedy of World War II, tens of millions of people were moving all around, not just in Europe, but in the Middle East. An enormous amount, I think about almost 20% of Baghdad was Jewish. They got kicked out of Baghdad largely. Alexandria, Morocco, and other places, and they were refugees and they were welcomed in Israel. Now, of course, nobody wants to see peace with the Palestinians more than the average Israeli. Golda Meir said, I know I've got over my 30 seconds, David, but Golda Meir said something like, look, you know, peace will come, you know, when the Palestinians hate us less than, peace will come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us. And I think that the long-term trend in that situation, in that part of the world, I believe is positive. I believe Trump's Abraham Accords, and what a magnificent name that was, are bearing fruit. And I think I am optimistic. So if it ever comes, look, not only will I vote the right way, that the AJ will be happy with, but I will be an advocate for AJA values.
Thanks, John. Look, before I signed on with the Lib Dems, the first thing I actually did was I wanted to see their foreign policy, particularly in respect of Israel. Now, you know, generally speaking, the Lib Dems don't like to get too involved in other countries' battles and things like that, but they had a very, very straightforward policy in respect that applied to Israel, which is very simply that the Lib Dems would support any modern liberal democracy that didn't seek to destroy other modern liberal democracies. And so it very specifically said that this at the moment would preclude the Palestinians of Gaza and the West Bank because they're sworn on the destruction of the state of Israel. So that's about as pro-Israel as it comes. Now, I mean, my pro-Israel credentials are very well established right back from being a Madrich in Beitar to living in Israel to, you know, fighting campus battles, to fighting media battles, to training young Hasbara activists through the Jewish Board of Deputies. And so forth, or on a more local basis, standing as a volunteer in security outside shuls for the better part of 20 years. And even though security is now my professional thing, I did it, you know, pro bono for many, many years. So, I mean, I've literally been on the front lines of protecting Jewish people in Sydney, and certainly see Israel as being on the front line globally of protecting it. There's nothing in the Lib Dems policy that would disagree with any of that, and the Lib Dems would be sensible. There was a question in the comments where Michael has asked, why am I running in an election where you have a candidate who's generally sympathetic to issues about Israel? And obviously you're talking about Dave Sharma, because I think based on Allegra Spender's undoing this morning, it would seem that she's got some hardcore anti-Semites working on her campaign, and that was a serious lack of due diligence. The you know, I mean, scratch a lefty, find an anti-Semite. She should have known better. Clearly, she didn't imagine her running the joint. But coming back to your question, funnily enough, and I mean, he's never said this, but there's actually a lot of people who think Dave Sharma is Jewish, and I think where they get confused is that he's not. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but he was the ambassador to Israel. Now, I thought he was a very good ambassador to Israel. I really did. And I also think he's a mensch. But being a mensch is not necessarily a qualification for being an effective leader or for being an effective politician. And the other thing to remember is that since his return to Australia, I think, David, you were asking about, say, the relocation of the embassy. It's important to note that whereas Donald Trump and America were right over that and their embassy moved, the Australian government, John, you'll probably have to correct me on this, but we basically abstained at best. It was, you know, and I do not remember Dave Sharma standing up as someone who I would have thought was fairly familiar with Israel and pro-Israel and saying, no, this is a joke. We need to move the embassy and that should be done. He didn't do it. But as we saw a few weeks ago in respect to transgenderism and so forth, he's got no problem crossing the floor when it suits him. So I think, you know, the highest praise I could probably pay David now that he's back on Australian soil is that he is a career diplomat. And the problem with diplomacy is diplomacy works very well when you're in a foreign land, but sometimes when you're here, you actually need someone to have an opinion, to get off the fence, to articulate that opinion, to say what they mean what they say, and then voters can take it or leave it. We can't have fence sitters. We actually need people who are going to drive this country forward. That's something I've done in business. You can ask me an opinion on any topic you care to mention, and anyone who knows me knows that I'll tell you my opinion, and you can take it or leave it. But if you ask people today, you know, what does Sharma stand for? What does Spender stand for? What does Scott Morrison stand for? They stand for whatever they think is going to get elected. And that's not going to take this country forward.
I think we clearly have budding politicians. You suggest 30 seconds, they take 3 minutes each. Alan, over to you for...
Okay, thanks, David. I'm going to ask David Segal to unmute himself. Just say hello to us, David, so that we can see where you are.
Hello. Can you see me?
Yes, we can. Good. Thank you very much. Now, the electorate of Goldstein has been in the news, obviously, because of Zoe Daniel, one of the climate alarmists standing as an independent. She has brought some controversy to the election with her anti-Israel statements that, funnily enough, seem to have mellowed once she was nominated for Goldstein with its significant Jewish population. So, David, you're standing as the Lib Dem candidate there. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to stand for election.
Firstly, a little bit about myself. I was a stockbroker for around about 30 years. I then went into the private sector, worked for a small biotech company for about 10 years 5 years as a director of that company, and then finished up there in May last year. And it's funny what happens when you've been locked up for 262 days. Your brain tends to go to mush. You've watched every Netflix video Netflix series that's around. So you really start playing with your mind. So I saw an interview with John Ruddick and Rowan Dean, and I have great respect for John Ruddick in terms of his political judgment. And so I was interested in the Liberal Democrats. Bearing in mind, I have never, ever been a member of a political party. I have never been a volunteer on a campaign. I have never obviously been a candidate. So it was something that was quite unusual for me to even bother to look it up. And then when Campbell Newman moved across, I thought this is something really quite interesting. And then I started to look at the principles of the party, and small government, lower taxes, individual choice, individual freedoms. It was really in my political sweet spot. And the irony is, I think it's actually in the sweet spot that the major parties wish they were, because it's really economically conservative and socially progressive. So that means to me, we have 50% of our people come ex-Libs. We have 40% come as ex-Labor, and we have 10% come from the Greens. And if you look at how we've operated in Victoria under David Limbrick, you'll see that we've had very strong opposition to the Labor Party in relation to vaccine mandates, lockdowns, and these sorts of freedoms that I just take for granted. And I've been gobsmacked at the popularity of them here. And I think the thing has turned. And so we do get a lot of people who have been discriminated against, who have been marginalised. And I think as a party, that's fantastic. But on the other side, we have a lot of people like myself who are disaffected Liberals, who my personal gripe with the Liberals was their failure to do anything about nuclear. I thought it was a real opportunity to wedge the Labor Party in a very difficult position. And not only did they sign up for net zero, they decided not to do anything on nuclear. So, you know, that's, in the end, I joined. And once I joined, next thing I know, I'm putting my hand up to be a candidate. So things have moved pretty quickly. I only been a member since September. I love the principles of the party. I love the fact that most of the people are sort of the same age as my sons instead of the same age as myself. I think that's a great advantage. Yeah. You've got people who are aspiring entrepreneurs who are part of the network. So I think that's fantastic. And being able to be a candidate in Goldstein, and in fact, I think, I might be wrong, I think I'm the only Jewish candidate in Goldstein. I feel that my Jewish connection gives me, I think, a great advantage. And you know, just in terms of my commitments to the Jewish community, I played football for Ajax for almost 250 games. I'm a life member of the club, and I think it's probably the biggest sporting club in the Jewish community in Melbourne. I also have been a long-term supporter of AJAC, who is effectively, I say, an Israeli lobby group. I've been a collector for JNF for the last 15 years since my father died, and he was a collector for 40 years before that. And I remember I used to look forward to, prior to the change in currency, he used to get all these pennies and threepences and sixpences, and he'd put them on the table, and I'd sort them all out, and I'd put them in my coin collection and put a corresponding note to make up for it. But, you know, these sorts of memories are things so I'm well entrenched within the Jewish community. So that's really where I'm at, who I am, and why I joined.
Okay, thanks, David. Now we'll go to questions. Just before we do, I'll hand back quickly to David, who needs to unmute, and you can tell us about next week and what else we need to know.
Okay, Alan, and thank you very much for the reminder to unmute. That's appreciated. Just very quickly, everyone here, if you're not yet actively supporting HAA in some way, we need you to do so, really. Go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au after this event, apply for membership, join the email list, make a donation, something. If you're not yet liking and following the HAA Facebook page, that's highly recommended. That's where the up-to-date news and views are. So I'll just tell you what's coming up in the next few days. We actually have 2 events, unusually. On Sunday, we have a special event which we're co-hosting with Scuffy, which is the Southern Cross Alliance for Israel. We're getting a special security briefing from Brigadier General Gal Hirsch. And as many of you will be aware, with the invasion of Ukraine, with the possible deal with Iran, with internal rise in terrorism in Israel, there's all sorts of complex and acute security issues. So it's a great privilege to get a direct security briefing from someone of the status of Brigadier General Gal Hirsch, and Scuffy have organised that for us. And then our regular event next Wednesday is going to have a detailed look at the education system in Israel, and with some of the demographic changes that are occurring in Israel, there's actually a lot of stress and possible decline. And we will be joined then by Professor Dan Ben David, who's the head of the Shoresh Institute and has repeatedly been named as one of the most influential people in Israel. So let's do questions, Alan.
Okay, thanks, David. Now, just before we go, I've got Anthony, Dennis and Jeff. Can I just ask the guys, when we were talking about preferences, and clearly we can put the Lib Dems first, does it make any difference who comes after that? Does it make any difference to you or how our vote eventually ends up?
No, it doesn't make any difference to us. If you put us first, that's the very best thing you can do for us. Now, there's no additional benefit. Now, after voting number 1 for Daniel or whatever, or David in Goldstein, of course, or myself in the Senate, it then comes down to who are the 2 candidates who, if we don't win, who are likely to win. So you can go and put multiple parties. You can put, let's talk about Wentworth. You can put Daniel 1. You can put multiple parties, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then as long as you put, if you wanted, for example, you wanted David Sharma to win ahead of Allegra Spender, as long as you put Dave Sharma 1 rung above Allegra Spender, then 100% of your vote is going to go count towards Dave Sharma, just as if you had put him number 1. It's exactly the same, that carries the same amount of potency.
Okay.
And Alan, I'll just make a quick point. Before David talked about a wasted vote for the minor parties. And one of the things I actually say to people, don't waste your vote by voting for a major party, because if you actually look at the 2 major parties, they are virtually indistinguishable in terms of policy. It's only a matter of degrees. And so I say to people, don't waste your vote. You have no opposition here. Whoever gets into power, it doesn't matter whether it's Liberal or Labor. So I think that's a point to emphasise. And therefore, in terms of...
That's a great line. I'm going to put that on Twitter later tonight. Don't waste your vote with a major party.
Yeah, because in the end, that really makes it relevant to not only vote for us, but also preference other minor parties. Because in the end, you're not going to have opposition if you just vote the same way you've done for the last 20, 30 years. Yeah. And you're not going to get any greater satisfaction out of it.
David makes a fantastic point. You know, I mean, there are so many people who regard, you know, every time they vote, they either vote the same way they've always voted and they expect something to change, or they get incredibly frustrated that, you know, it's the choice between the least worst. But that's really only if you look at the major parties. Now, remember, the major parties want you to believe that minor parties are bad news and you'll have hung parliaments and things like that. And it's a myth. The Senate has never had a thumping government majority, ever. It's always had a cross-section of parties. And so if you're happy with everything that's happened and you don't want to see anything change, then you wouldn't be here tonight. But if you want to see, you know, a viable third alternative, for example, that's what I think the Lib Dems could be. I think we're really a startup party that's going places. The party's got a history, but we feel like a startup at the moment. You know, but there is actually opportunity there. The major parties do not want you to believe that. Don't fall for the myth. The problem, though, is that they've got huge resources, huge. Now, Allegra Spender, Zoe Daniel, look, they've got climate investor billionaires throwing millions of them, which basically is marketing money, because if they can win, well, those billionaires are going to make further billions of dollars. The Liberal and the Labor Party both get huge dollars thrown at them by people that essentially just want to buy favours. And the thing that really amazed me, it's amazing what you learn when you do this, is that people who, you know, in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, who I assumed would be traditional Liberal voters, were donating big money to the Liberals, but they were also donating money to the Labor Party just so they could have a bet each way. Yeah. So these parties have got huge, huge money. We don't. You know, we need support. We need not only people to hand out how to vote cards, but we also need, people to help with flyers. You know, we need money. If you want to see a change in this nation, if you want to see an improvement, I'm popping it up on the screen now. That's my website. I've also put in comments the Lib Dems website. Please go there, donate, tell your friends. I don't have the money to be driving diesel-powered LCD trucks around the eastern suburbs or putting my face on the side of a bus, which I have to tell you has a slimming effect, by the way. You know, instead, you know, this is as grassroots as it comes, but, you know, we're not career politicians. We're people who know what happens when the politicians get it wrong. And we want to see change. And if you want to see change, and if you want to see this nation taken forward and some big ideas, we need the help, we need the support. That means when you get off this call, tell your friends, go, hey, I saw this guy. It's great. I'll tell you an interesting story.
Let's go to a few questions. We've got some people with their hands up, and we haven't got a lot of time.
We'll come back to that, Daniel. Anthony, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you all. Look, I think what's happened in Australia is we've started to the politicians have started to listen to those who shout loudest, and the average person is being ignored. From the way I see it, of people that I'm in organisations with, etc., and speak to, the average person is being totally ignored in Australia. The parties of the left have become the parties of big business and academia, and the small business people, and the rural people, and the average worker has been pushed out of the way. I would like to see the Democrats
just focus on the question, please.
All right. I'd like to see them talk more about freedom. In fact, call themselves the Party of Freedom. And even if that includes, well, you've got to attack and I would ask you if you would be attacking the social issues of gender fluidity.
May I answer that? The Lib Dems have a document called the Freedom Manifesto. Our party's slogan is less government, more freedom. So when we say we're a freedom party, it's literally in our slogan. I urge you to go to the Lib Dems website and have a look at the Freedom Manifesto. And it doesn't even matter if you're a bit left-wing, you're a bit right-wing. There's something in there for everybody. Freedom Manifesto. It's an amazing document. And, you know, most people who've voted a particular way their entire life have never even been to the party website to see what their policy is. And half the time, if you went there, you'd see that they say one thing and do another. The Freedom Manifesto, I encourage you to read it.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. We'll take Dennis now. Please unmute yourself, Dennis. Okay.
Thank you. This is a very fragmented election that's coming. We have more parties, more people have grouped together and called themselves independents. We have Clive Palmer's people. We have all the regular parties as well spending up huge amounts of money. and creating a lot of noise. Even with all the money that Clive Palmer is spending, he's going to get less than 3% of the vote. How are you going to cut through? How are you going to have an influence? What is going to make people vote for you?
Well, look, at what happened at the last federal election, the minor party vote, which is really particularly important in the Senate campaign, was very low. Now, that was because it was a close election. People expected there to be a change of government, but they weren't certain. And so people didn't risk the voting for a minor party. Now, if we go to the previous election in 2016, the minor party vote was very high. And that was because Malcolm Turnbull was the Prime Minister and what we might call the Conservative base were unhappy with Malcolm Turnbull. And so therefore, they did generally vote for him in the lower house, but in the Senate, the minor parties did very, very well. Now, I think if people were upset with Malcolm Turnbull in 2016, I think that there will be 2 to 3 times the amount of people upset this time. And I think that as we get closer and closer to the election, that people will be investigating the credible parties that may get that might have a bit of a breakthrough at this election. Now, I think that we have things in common with the United Australia Party and with some other parties. However, as Daniel mentioned, we've got the Freedom Manifesto, which we're very proud of. I've just put it into the chat box, and I think that people will see that. Oh, thank you. I think people will see that that is. That makes us the most credible alternative. This document is basically what Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan was standing for in the 1980s and Newt Gingrich in the 1990s. Small government, lower taxes, deregulation, pro-business, pro-foreign investment, and empowering citizens.
And a sensible energy policy as well, which also includes nuclear, as opposed to putting in things which make money for climate investors, but we'll see the lights go out for the rest of us.
Okay, thanks, Daniel.
I was just going to make one very quick point. Just, Dennis, in terms of Victoria, the David Limbrick is a very well-known politician as it is. He's been seen as the saviour in terms of Victoria, in terms of lockdowns and things. He's seen as the real opposition because the Liberals have provided no opposition to Andrews. So he has a very popular figure, I think, has given us a real chance. And in fact, I love to have him in terms of on my boards and things next to me, because they'll at least recognise him even if they don't recognise me.
Yep, thank you. Jeff, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Greetings, people. Daniel Lewkovitz mentioned earlier that we lack talent in the Parliament, and that is so manifestly correct. Sir Percy Spender was one of the great ministers in the Menzies government, and he would proverbially turn in his grave if he found out what he could actually be held responsible for directly or indirectly, meaning Allegra. So why on earth...
The big spender.
Indeed. Sir Percy was great. However, as to lacking in talent, it is not surprising that there's such a manifest lacking in talent amongst parliamentarians, but almost 50% of it, and sometimes more than 50%, are socialists, which are de facto communists. What do you say about that?
Well, I think what has happened is I know, I'm not going to name names, but I could tell you 12 members of the coalition, the Federal Parliamentary Party of the Liberal and the National Party, who before they went into Parliament were true believers, who were saying all the right things, that we're going to promote small government and do all these things. Now they get in there and they get hooked on the glory of being a federal member of Parliament. They get a big flash car, they get a big flash office, they get lots of nice staff, they get treated as the most important person when they go into any room. Now, another thing that happens to these people, and often getting into Parliament when you're in your 30s is a curse, because they then go and get themselves a big mortgage and a big house, and they have wife and kids. Now they are then they are chained to getting re-elected to Parliament. Parliamentarians find it difficult to find employment after Parliament. So you can go in there and be an idealistic, but then they get hooked on that big salary. They get themselves on committees. They get more and more salary. What I think that the Liberal Democrats I can promise you. Now, I know other politicians have made similar promises, But if a handful of Liberal Democrats get elected at the coming election, and we have a reasonable chance of getting several senators elected at the next election, and hopefully Daniel and David will do very well and set themselves up for the future. But we really are a party not driven by egomaniacs. We really are people who believe in ideas, and I am certain that we will stick with those ideas.
Yeah, just along the lines of that, a lot of the candidates, and I've met a number of them, had to be dragged kicking and screaming to their announcement. And I can relate to that. I sat on the fence and it was a little while before I got off, right? This is as opposed to people who've been, in the party office and sort of waiting 9, 10 years for their turn. And of course, when it's their turn, they're not going to do anything to screw that up, like, I don't know, say what they really believe. Okay, I have a job to go back to. These other people are doing it for all the right reasons. And that's really what I referred to when I said people are talent. But there is another problem. We live in an increasingly hostile society where we don't have the ability to have a frank exchange of ideas. People who are politically polar opposites should still be able to have a discussion, have an argument, and still be friends. But now that doesn't happen. I mean, I'll tell you a funny story. This morning I was out on the hustings and I was down at the Cosmos Centre in Double Bay, and I was having a coffee before I went to hand out flyers and things. And given the nature of my work, my spidey senses started tingling, and I suddenly noticed a bunch of AFP dignitary protection officers. And sure enough, a minute later, Josh Frydenberg with David Sharma, flanked by a whole bunch of sort of Liberal Party staff, walk into the Cosmos Centre to, shake hands and kiss babies and whatever. And I thought, oh, well, this is too good an opportunity. So I thought I'd just, bound over and have a chat and so forth. Now, the Australian Federal Police were totally cool. I mean, they literally knew me. They knew I was no threat, but the young libs who were there or whatever were freaking out, and they were like physically putting their body in my way. And David and Josh ended up running into a whiskey store and basically hiding in there until I left. And I had to go eventually because I had elsewhere to go. But the point is this: had they just come over and said g'day, we wouldn't have. There would have been no problem. It would have been very entertaining. We would have had a good laugh. I mean, the point is, Josh Frydenberg's probably never been in the Cosmos, and I've been going there since I was a 5-year-old. Tomorrow morning in the papers, if you read that, Lib Dem's candidate stalks and threatens whatever, well, Adam, you're in this chat. I think I ran into your daughter there as well. She and I had a chat. I think I might have converted a couple of people as well. But we don't have that. So people don't want to go into politics because they're terrified that, well, if I do this, then they're going to start attacking my company. They're going to start, bullying me. It's dangerous. It discourages people from going into it. Now, I'm not someone who easily scares. I don't get scared by knives and guns and terrorists and whatever. So mean tweets don't bother me. But this stuff's really dangerous because the smartest people in society who we should be forcing into politics are taking a back seat to people who just kind of fall over the line, and that's not good for the leadership of this nation either.
Yeah. Okay. Now, well, we're coming up to time. Robert, our Director of Public Affairs, have you got a question that you want to ask from the chat?
Yeah, just a quick one. How much of Lib Dem policy is from the party, and how much is from the individual candidate's conscience?
Well, look, we don't have a full suite of party policies. So we have our Freedom Manifesto, which certainly should indicate to people what our approach is to policies that we don't specify. Now, in terms of, we're not rigid. When I used to work for the Liberal Party, they used to say to those candidates in marginal seats, they used to just shut their mouths. They couldn't say anything that wasn't officially ordained from on high in Canberra. Now, we are fine to give our individual candidates a reasonable amount of liberty to speak out on other issues, and we basically have faith in them that they are going to be in line with the Freedom Manifesto.
Except one. And what do you remember what that one is, John?
Don't hit me.
I was told at my candidate interview, if you ever vote to increase a tax, you'll be disendorsed before you finish the sentence.
Oh, yes.
Okay, look, I think we're going to have to leave it there. When you get a bunch of politicians in a room, I think the only way you finish it is by pulling the plug. So
can I just make a closing comment that we will, as HAA, speak to a number of parties and candidates and members of parliament, and the official AJA position is to convey information. We don't give endorsements to parties or candidates, so that needs to be said during this recording as well.
Yeah, thanks, David. So, look, guys, John, Daniel, and David, thank you so much for joining us. We've seen the website put up in the chat, so people will find you. There was a question about which electorates you're fielding candidates in, so I imagine that's all online too. So we'll ask people to do that. I think Australia's in desperate need of a true Conservative party, and it's fantastic that you're having a crack at it, and we wish you all the very best of luck in the upcoming election. So thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much.
Okay, just before we go, the L'chaim program with Morris Klein is just about to start on 3ZZZ. Tonight, Morris is interviewing Mark Zell, who is the lawyer suing Ben and Jerry. So that should be interesting. But that's all we have for tonight. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with what the AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. So please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you again next week, or as usual, but also before that, we'll see you on Sunday night for that special event. So it's from me, it's good night to you all. Bye for now.